Mariana stood by the kitchen window, watching as the wind gently swayed the leaves of the trees in the garden. The silence in the house was suffocating. She had grown accustomed to the emptiness, but the absence of her son still lingered like an open wound. Every corner of the house held memories of the child she had lost in a tragic accident, and every time she thought about how he was ripped from her life, a burning rage ignited in her chest. Eduardo, that was the name that haunted Mariana's thoughts. The man who, in a drunken stupor, had caused the accident that claimed her son's life. He had served his sentence, but there was no comfort in that. How could there be? No justice could ever be enough. The void her son left behind would never be filled, and the thought of forgiving Eduardo felt like a betrayal to the memory of the child she had loved so deeply. Her husband, Rafael, was her only support, but even he dealt with the grief differently. He believed forgiveness was the key to moving forward, a path to healing. Holding on to this anger will only destroy us, he would say repeatedly. But Mariana couldn't listen. How could she forgive the man who had shattered her life? One evening, as they ate dinner in silence, Rafael suddenly began coughing violently. Mariana watched in alarm as he excused himself and went to the bathroom. This had happened several times over the past few weeks, but Rafael always brushed it off, insisting it was nothing more than stress. The days dragged on, each one emptier than the last. Mariana felt trapped in an endless cycle of grief and anger. The world continued to spin, but she was frozen in time, stuck in the moment she had lost her son. Now, the only person keeping her grounded seemed to be falling ill before her very eyes. One afternoon, Rafael finally agreed to see a doctor. Mariana accompanied him to the hospital, her heart weighed down with worry. When they left the doctor's office, the look on the physician's face was grave. Rafael is very sick, the doctor said. We need to act quickly. He will need a transplant, and without it, his chances of survival are slim. The ground seemed to vanish beneath Mariana's feet. How could this be happening? She had already lost her son, and now fate threatened to take her husband, too. The thought of losing Rafael suffocated her. She couldn't let it happen. But finding a compatible donor would be a race against time. And time, as she well knew, was not often on her side. The news of Rafael's illness hit their home like an unexpected blow, spreading fear like wildfire. The doctor had been clear. Rafael needed a transplant urgently. But the real challenge was finding a suitable donor in time. Mariana, already burdened by the loss of her son, now faced yet another battle. The man who had been her pillar of strength was now on the verge of losing his life, and the thought of living without him was unbearable. Despite the grief that still consumed her, Mariana clung to the hope that a solution would be found. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of tests, consultations, and desperate attempts to find a donor. Mariana spent hours on the phone with doctors and specialists, trying anything and everything to save her husband. But each time, the answers were always the same. No compatible donor had been found. The tension in the house grew as Rafael's condition worsened. Mariana watched helplessly as he became more pale and frail, his once occasional cough now constant and unrelenting. Still, Rafael tried to remain optimistic, comforting Mariana whenever he could. "Everything's going to be okay, my love. Something will come through," he would say with a tired smile. But deep down, Mariana knew that time was running out. She had already lost part of herself when her son died, and now she was on the brink of losing everything. The pain was suffocating, but what made it even more unbearable was the helplessness. She felt powerless against fate, like a mere spectator watching a tragedy unfold before her eyes. Rafael, on the other hand, seemed more at peace than she expected, even as his condition grew more dire. He believed there was a solution, that there was a way out, regardless of the outcome. His desire to find peace, no matter how things turned out, was palpable, and that only made Mariana's anguish worse. How could he be so calm when she could barely breathe under the weight of fear? Then, one morning, after another sleepless night filled with dread, the phone rang. It was the hospital. Mariana answered, bracing herself for another rejection. But this time, something was different. The voice on the other end said that they had finally found a potential match for Raphael. For a moment, her heart raced. Could it really be? Could they have found the miracle they so desperately needed? The salvation they had long awaited had finally arrived. However, the next sentence from the doctor made Mariana's world tremble. The name of the donor was Eduardo, the man responsible for the death of her son. Mariana could barely comprehend what she was hearing. Fate, in its cruel and twisted irony, had placed Eduardo back in her life. And this time, he was the only hope to save Raphael. The phone slipped from her hands as she stood frozen, unable to process the weight of this revelation. Eduardo, the man who had shattered her world, now stood as the only chance for her husband's survival. His name echoed in her mind like a ghost from the past, haunting her with memories of loss and anguish. She couldn't believe the cruel hand that destiny had dealt her. How could the man who had taken her son, the one who made her live through the darkest days of her life, now be the one who could save her husband? It was an impossible moral dilemma. Raphael noticed the shock on Mariana's face as he entered the room. "What happened? Who called?" he asked, visibly concerned. Mariana, still struggling to piece her thoughts together, looked at him, trying to find the right words. "They found a donor," she said hesitantly, "but it's Eduardo." Raphael took a moment to process the information. Eduardo, the man from the accident? His face mirrored the confusion and disbelief that Mariana felt. He knew what that name represented for her. He knew that Eduardo's name was synonymous with pain and rage, a constant reminder of the day their lives changed forever. And yet, now they were faced with an impossible decision. Mariana realized that if she rejected the donation, she might be condemning Raphael to die. But if she accepted, she would have to live with the knowledge that her husband's life had been saved by the man she despised most in the world. Her mind swirled with a chaotic mix of emotions: hatred, anger, despair, and, strangely enough, hope. A few days later, Mariana received an unexpected visit. Eduardo, looking frail and burdened by illness, had asked to see her. He knew he was the only compatible donor, and he wanted to speak with her before making his final decision. Reluctantly, Mariana agreed to the meeting. When Eduardo entered the room, the tension was almost suffocating. Mariana couldn't hide the contempt in her eyes, while Eduardo seemed weighed down by his own guilt and regret. He sat across from her, unable to meet her gaze at first. "I know I don't deserve to be here," Eduardo began, his voice low and trembling. "I know nothing I say can change what happened, but I'm dying, and this is my only chance to do something good before I go." Mariana remained silent, her heart pounding with a silent fury. She listened to his words, but the rage inside her was still burning. She couldn't believe his audacity. Did he really think that offering an organ could somehow make amends for taking her son? "You think you can erase what you did? That donating an organ will bring my son back?" Mariana's voice was laced with bitterness, every word dripping with the resentment she had harbored for years. Eduardo took a deep breath, his face etched with remorse. "I know nothing will bring your son back. I'm not trying to fix what can't be fixed. But if I can save someone now, then I need to do it. Even if you never forgive me, I want to try." His words hit Mariana like a punch to the gut. She could see that Eduardo was sincere, broken by his own guilt, and now facing his own mortality. He was a man desperate for redemption, even though he knew it was out of reach. "I lost everything after that accident, Mariana," Eduardo continued. "I lost my family, my friends. I sank into despair. And while that doesn't change what I did, at least I can leave this world knowing I did something right, even if it's in my last moments." The moral dilemma that Mariana faced only deepened. She despised Eduardo with every fiber of her being, but at the same time, Raphael needed his help. How could she reconcile the fact that the man who had taken her greatest joy was now the only one who could prevent her from losing her husband too? There were no easy answers, just a deep and growing pain. Eduardo's words echoed in her mind. Each sentence, each expression of regret, chipped away at the armor she had built around her sorrow. For years, she had fed her anger towards Eduardo, believing that her fury was the only way to honor her son's memory. But now, sitting across from him, seeing his vulnerability and the strange twist of fate that had brought them together again, the layers of her hatred began to crumble. It revealed a truth far more complex and unsettling than she had ever imagined. Mariana had clung to her anger for so long, convinced that it was the only thing that kept her son's memory alive. But now, seeing Eduardo broken, remorseful, offering not just his redemption but also Raphael's life, she felt torn. Forgiving him felt like a betrayal of her son's memory. Yet Raphael's frailty pushed her toward a decision that seemed impossible to make. Eduardo, weakened by illness, kept his gaze fixed on her, waiting silently for her response. Finally, Mariana spoke, her voice trembling with pain. "You destroyed my life, Eduardo. You took everything from me, and now you want to force me to accept your help. Your redemption?" Her words were sharp, but there was an underlying sorrow in her tone. Eduardo lowered his head, clearly bracing himself for her anger. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he whispered. "I know that's something I can never ask for. Forgive me, Mariana. I know I don't deserve it, but Raphael doesn't have to pay for my mistakes," Eduardo said, his voice trembling with sincerity. A sharp pang of anger shot through Mariana as she heard his words. He was right, of course. Raphael shouldn't have to suffer for something that had nothing to do with him. But how could she possibly accept that her husband's life now depended on the mercy of the man who had caused her greatest tragedy? "What do you expect from this, Eduardo? That I'll forgive you? That I'll be grateful?" Her words were laced with bitterness. But deep down, Mariana already knew she was facing something far bigger than just her rage. Eduardo met her eyes, his voice barely above a whisper, shaky and frail. "I expect nothing, Mariana. I know I can't undo what I did, but I can save Raphael. And maybe, in some small way, that will help you move forward. Even if you never forgive me." For a long time, Mariana remained silent, staring at him. Her mind raced, thinking of all that she had lost, the life that Eduardo had snatched from her, and the emptiness that had consumed her ever since. But at the same time, she knew that her anger was destroying her, just as it threatened to tear apart her marriage with Raphael. He had always believed that forgiveness was the only path to healing. But could she follow that path? Or should she continue to let the fire of hatred burn within her? Raphael's words echoed in her mind. "Holding on to this anger will only destroy us." She knew the weight that her hatred carried over their lives. And now, in this moment, she felt that perhaps he was right. The days following her conversation with Eduardo were filled with deep reflection. Mariana withdrew into herself, replaying everything in her mind. She knew that sooner or later, she would have to make a decision. It was a decision that teetered on the edge of life and death, of hatred and forgiveness. Raphael had no idea about Eduardo's offer, and she had no idea how to tell him. Her husband had the right to live, but the price she would have to pay seemed unimaginable. As Raphael's health continued to deteriorate, Mariana began to realize that by clinging to her hatred for Eduardo, she was also blocking any possibility of moving forward. Even if she could never completely forgive him, perhaps acceptance was the first step. One afternoon, while sitting by Raphael's bedside, she took his hand and, with a deep sigh, began to speak to him about Eduardo. Raphael, already weakened, listened quietly, his eyes reflecting more understanding than any words could. When she finished telling him about Eduardo, the silence in the room was suffocating. Raphael lay there with his eyes closed, his breathing labored. But when he finally spoke, his voice was soft yet steady. "I already knew," he said, surprising Mariana. "You knew?" She could barely believe it. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Raphael opened his eyes slowly, looking at her with a mixture of exhaustion and calm. "I knew you needed to come to this decision on your own. I believe in forgiveness, but I also know I can't force you to feel the same way. I thought if you knew, you wouldn't have the time or space to process everything you're feeling." Mariana felt a storm of emotions. Anger, confusion, but also understanding. A part of her was furious that Raphael had kept this from her. But another part knew he had done it out of love. He had always believed that forgiveness was the key to moving forward, even when she refused to see things the same way. "I can't ask you to forgive him," Raphael continued, his voice gentle, "but I need to believe that this hatred won't consume what we still have. If I accept the transplant, it's not just for me. It's for our life together. Despite everything that's happened, I want to keep living by your side." Raphael's words pierced Mariana's heart. He wasn't asking her to forgive Eduardo. He was asking her to let go of the pain that was destroying her, to accept the gift of life that they still had together. Even though Eduardo had been responsible for their greatest tragedy, Raphael was ready to accept his help. "I knew this would be difficult for you to accept," Raphael said, letting out a weary sigh, "but I believe there's a chance for peace in the midst of all this pain, a chance for both of us." Mariana looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. The love she felt for Raphael was overwhelming, but it was being suffocated by years of hatred and resentment. She knew in that moment that this wasn't just about saving Raphael's life. It was about saving what remained of their marriage. "I don't know if I can forgive him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I can't lose you too." Raphael smiled faintly, a sad but understanding smile. "That's all I needed to hear." Mariana sat there with a heavy heart, knowing that the final decision rested in her hands. The path she chose now wouldn't just save Raphael's life. It would forever change how she dealt with loss and forgiveness. Mariana felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss of emotions she wasn't sure she could face. Even after her conversation with Raphael, the decision weighed on her chest like an anchor. She knew what was at stake, and Raphael's time was running out. A tumultuous mix of fear, anger, and guilt churned inside her. Accepting the transplant meant accepting that Eduardo, the man who had taken her son, might paradoxically save her husband. Yet, Raphael's words echoed in her mind. He was ready to live, even if it meant accepting the heart of someone who had caused so much pain. He believed in forgiveness, though Mariana wasn't there yet. She understood that the decision wasn't just about Raphael's fate, but also about how she would choose to live her life from that moment onward. In the hospital, time seemed to move faster than usual. Raphael was growing weaker, and the doctors made it clear there wasn't much time left to decide. Mariana's heart tightened with every passing moment, but she knew she couldn't wait any longer. Finally, after days of agonizing reflection, she made her decision. She accepted the transplant, knowing that she wasn't forgiving Eduardo. She was choosing to save Raphael. It was a choice for life, a step, however small, toward healing them both. Even though full forgiveness still seemed far out of reach, perhaps acceptance was the beginning. Eduardo, aware that his time was nearly over, accepted the role of donor without hesitation. He knew this would be his last chance to do something right. In a scene filled with emotion, Eduardo quietly bid farewell to the world, believing that his death, in some way, would grant Raphael a new life. Despite everything, he left with the hope that he had found some measure of redemption in his final act. The surgery was successful. Raphael survived, and though still weak, he began to recover slowly. By his side, Mariana felt a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. Eduardo was gone, and his sacrifice, despite all it represented, had saved Raphael's life. Days later, Mariana went to the cemetery, not to visit Eduardo's grave, but to sit by her son's. There, in the quiet, she reflected on all that had happened. The pain of loss still throbbed in her chest, but she realized something had changed. The hatred that had consumed her for so long had begun to weaken. "I haven't forgiven you," she murmured, as if speaking to the wind, to the ghost of Eduardo. "But today I chose life, and maybe, one day, I'll find peace with that choice." In that moment, Mariana felt that the journey toward healing had finally begun. She and Raphael still had a long road ahead, but together, they would face the future, carrying the scars of the past, but also holding on to the hope for better days. Months passed after the transplant, and Raphael, now stronger, walked slowly through the park with Mariana by his side. The scar from the surgery was a physical reminder of everything they had endured, but there was a new lightness in his gaze, something Mariana hadn't seen in a long time. Life was returning to him, and with it came a sense of hope and renewal. Mariana, too, felt different. The weight of the hatred that had once suffocated her had lessened. There wasn't full forgiveness, yet perhaps there never would be, but she was beginning to understand that forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a process, and that process had started the moment she chose to save Raphael. Accepting Eduardo's heart was a step in the right direction, a step that had freed her, at least a little, from the chains of her pain. As they walked side by side, Raphael stopped for a moment, taking Mariana's hand in his. Their eyes met, and he smiled, a smile filled with gratitude and love. "I wouldn't have made it without you," he said softly. "You gave me a second chance." Mariana smiled back, knowing that the second chance Raphael had received wasn't just for him. It was for both of them. The transplant had not only saved Raphael's life, but it had also given them both a new opportunity to rebuild their lives and their hopes. Perhaps in time they could even find peace with the past. "We're in this together," Mariana replied. "I'm learning to live again, too." As they continued walking, the wind blew softly around them, and for the first time in years, Mariana felt ready to move forward. The pain of losing her son was still there, and it always would be, but now she carried it differently, without the hatred, without the burden that had been destroying her. As she looked toward the horizon, she knew there would still be challenges ahead, but now, with Raphael by her side and the decision she had made, there was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The journey toward forgiveness and healing would be long, but finally, she was on the right path. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories. We'll see you in the next one.